Rorty rejects the idea that we should try to do things justice in a realistic manner. Rorty says, "We have to stop accounting for anything other than ourselves." That was the end of the issue of objectivity for him. For Foucault, the need for theory is something he has had enough of. And Lyotard is like Feyerabend, of the opinion that all argumentation only serves to dupe an unsuspecting opponent. At the beginning of the 21st century, the good reputation of rationality was no longer available, and postmodernism played a significant part in this. For Lyotard, thinking is nothing more than a reflection on the non-identical, on what the modern era's obsession with identification and generalization has systematically ignored. The not understanding now comes to the fore in Lyotard. He is convinced that real understanding is unattainable anyway. But because he does not distinguish between the objective world at all and the subjective for me world, Lyotard creates the impression that basically all understanding, including pragmatic one, is meaningless. Albrecht Koschorke also addresses this hidden objectivism of Lyotard in his essay, Leftward Shift of Facts. Koschorke is of the opinion that the undertaking of left-wing criticism of power, in Deridda, as in Foucault, is based on the open or tacit confidence that ideological buildings can be shaken or even brought down, if it is shown that they essentially consist of referenceless speech acts that do not arise from an essence of things, or from the depth of an origin. If Koschorke is right about this, then, as with Kant, Godfather Everybody would also provide proof of universally valid rationality for the postmodernists. But that would be a pure grand narrative, because all the prerequisites for such proof will be missing in the foreseeable future. The danger therefore exists that even in postmodernism one is dealing with an illusionary overestimation of logical thinking and a misjudgment of one's own objectivism. Because a common sense, or a consciousness in general, is still expected. In the essay, What is Postmodern? Lyotard writes on page 48, "It is not our place to provide reality, but only allusions to something conceivable that cannot be represented." Here one might think that Lyotard has finally said goodbye to objective reality because a generally valid logic has now become obsolete and no longer has any meaning. But if one reads Lyotard in other places, one can certainly doubt whether the leader of the postmodern movement has actually renounced universalist objectivist and logocentric thinking as much as he himself believes. In the differend, page 74, it says, for example, "Reality must be proven, and it will be better proven the more independent evidence you can cite." This almost sounds like a plea for consensus in the spirit of Habermas. But you could already read that in Nietzsche, that the establishment of facts is based on an agreement. But this does not provide any evidence of any reality at all. Also in the differend, page 78, one reads, "A reality can be shown as an example that the cognitive sentence is true." A rejection of truth, or reality, looks different. If we were talking about a subjective truth, one could let the whole thing pass, but that is not the case. Page 79 says, "All flowers that emit radiation with a wavelength of 650 to 750 nanometer band can serve as an example to validate the cognitive sentence that they are red." Here someone is citing nothing other than to a convention, to a basically arbitrary determination of units of measurement, as is the case with all measurements, in order to validate a statement. As if it were about truth and knowledge, and not a practical agreement. Habermas and his red ball send greetings. When Lyotard writes in the differend that reality is never fixed, then that is anything but clear and distinct. Why doesn't he say that there is no reality at all, when supposedly there is no longer any referent available for the signifier, reality? Lyotard claims to be able to show the reality of an object with an ostensive sentence and thus validate a cognitive sentence. Such an ostensive showing only makes sense if it happens in a very specific situation in which a very specific purpose is pursued, and validation also takes place with regard to this purpose. In itself and independent of the concrete situation, i.e. independent of a pragmatic interest, this view of validating a cognitive sentence, in itself, through a show, is nothing but nonsense. When it says in The Differend, page 85, reality cannot be expressed by a sentence like, X is such, but only by a sentence, X is so and not so, then Lyotard actually seems to reject the at all definition and undertake a pragmatic relativization in which X is not simply so or so, but is determined in comparison to something else. But it should be made clear that it is in no way an objective reality. Lyotard can emphasize as much as he likes that the ontological argument is false, and an equivalence between reality and meaning is impossible unless he either drops his concept of reality or declares it to be clearly subjective pragmatic. Because the ambiguity and confusion remains that way continue to exist, validation cannot in any way mean an objective process. Only a subjective validity can be claimed, which, however, cannot be transferred from one individual to another. There is no general procedure for validating a cognitive sentence, in itself and in general, and this also applies to the validation of any other sentence from the range of language games. If Lyotard, page 88, claims in The Differend about the persistence of a referent that the reality of an X can be determined because one recognizes it, then a determination of the object must have taken place beforehand, which is only valid as long as the appearance of an object is continuous or recognizable. But this is not the same for all times and in every place. In The Differend, page 89, Lyotard asserts the real properties of a referent. Such objectification of practical motives into a supra-individual reality does not exactly help to come to terms with the usual delusions of reality. Compared to the oft-quoted sentence at the end of Lyotard's essay, What is Postmodern? 1982, that it is not up to us to deliver reality. The Differend, 1983, acts more as a softening towards practical realities. In his earlier essay, 1982, Lyotard wanted to warn against starting the terror again and that phantasm of embracing reality into action. In The Differend, validates like hell, but not subjectively, but objectively. No wonder, then, if the inventors of the new realism in Lyotard do not have the decisive one, finding himself an opponent that he had been just before The Differend. And so there were many stagings for the repopularity of the fiction of the real, which Baudrillard denounces as summit events of a cosmos of simulation. At the turn of the millennium, neo-realism was heard from all channels, and the natural view of things in themselves had once again become commonly acceptable. Realists and positivists were now more and more forced to make smaller concessions. Instead of objectivity, realists now spoke of intersubjectivity, or just experience, and similar cosmetic corrections, but the basic attitude of a provable reality was not abandoned. Moritz Schlick from the Vienna Circle claimed around 1920 that there is only one reality, and the representatives of analytic philosophy are still looking for a really existing and true world. When, at the beginning of the 21st century, powerful contemporary diagnosticians proclaim a generally held desire for reality, then one would think that 100 years of discussion about naive realism have not taken place at all. That intellectual progress is impossible at all because the mass understanding rotates in a completely natural cycle. A summer with lots of sun and light is followed by a winter with cloudy skies and a realm of shadows. Mankind follows a law of nature. An era of spiritual clarity is followed by confusion and darkness, only to be illuminated again, and so on. That wouldn't be so bad if it resulted in more and more clarity at the end. But that's not the case. It's always starting more or less from the beginning with very insignificant variations, the old song with new lyrics, but you can't make a single step further. Even among the ancient Greek skeptics there were those who realized that the thing in itself was unknowable. Kant put the problem back on the agenda 2,000 years later. But the insult that the godlike mind of man, in Kant's time, would have had to accept by this definitive limit to knowledge and truth was probably too painful. If you consider that, even in the 21st century, the Internet proves that the Earth as a disk can still be expected, then you could well get the idea that the topic of thing in itself is completely out of reach because common sense will simply believe what it sees for all eternity. For those who think naively, it is simply too obvious that planet Earth would exist even if humans had never existed. So anyone who claims that no reality exists, independently of consciousness, is talking nothing but nonsense. In the 19th century, academic circles were abuzz with treatises on the reality of the outside world. A lot of intellectual sophistication was wasted on a misunderstanding that would have been quickly cleared up if only more attention had been paid to the critical voices that questioned formal logic. The problem was not whether something exists, but whether this something can be recognized, objectively, as something very specific, without the need for an agreement. Naive realists and positivists were and continue to be of the opinion that things in themselves, as they are, can be immediately known through the senses. Reality is given to them in their sensory experience. They draw conclusions from the regularity of natural and mechanical processes to the higher principle of natural laws. No problem is seen in the fact that the conclusion of generality is something principally different from an empirical experience. It is also not taken into account that time and space are arbitrarily determined units of measurement that must first be identified with some objects in order to produce a law. The practical utility of the measurement methods is simply transformed into a theoretical proof. The fact that the use of measurement methods is problematic, especially when it comes to areas that cannot easily be subjected to any measurement, is ignored. When human behavior is made measurable by looking at this behavior from a normative point of view. In order to better understand it or to have control, science has exceeded its authority. Such a reliance on a method of measurable units also led to the desire to make the meaning of concepts understandable through a subject-independent logic during the era of metaphysics. Anything that did not fit into this logic was declared an ideology, a phantasm, and was irrelevant because it was merely a subjective opinion. For example, it was asserted with full conviction that the Battle of Cannae, where the Carthaginians and Hannibal defeated an overwhelming Roman army, is an objective fact. But the Battle of Cannae is nothing more than a concept. People have agreed on its use for a variety of reasons. The usual historical procedure is relatively straightforward. simple terms that most people can make a plausible sense of. Terms like battle, and war, and struggle, but also cane, as a place, very quickly lead to a common understanding of the meaning of these terms. The same applies to points in time. And if there are any documents that have come down to us that can be used to say exactly when this battle took place, then hardly anyone doubts that of an objective fact can be spoken. In reality, however, this fact is preceded by an agreement about which characteristics or properties a thing must have in order to be considered a generally valid fact. Only if you agree that a battle is just a battle and you don't need to know exactly how many legionnaires or Carthaginians were involved or died or injured in it. A little information is enough to speak of a true event. It was just a battle, and the details don't matter. They don't change the outcome. So the term objective fact can only refer to what a certain group of people defines as an objective fact, by specifying that what is important and unimportant for this. If you look for evidence for this fact, then you will only find what is left, historically. But the actual contemporaries who were there themselves would in all probability have had a whole different view of what actually happened. Just as every survivor of a modern world war makes a different fact of it. This need for a prior definition of the course of action and what is to be considered a success exists not only for historical events, but for all kinds of possible facts, that is, for every objective reality. But not only that, for every term that is used in a statement. It must be determined beforehand how it is to be understood, and such a determination can never be objective or universally valid. Because all terms define each other, and at the end of a series of definitions you realize that the sense and meaning of the terms that were first defined has now become completely different. Nevertheless, a purposive definition can be successful if the respective purpose is achieved, and a definition only applies as long as this purpose is pursued. Anyone who thinks that they are dealing with general terms in scientific treatises can quickly experience a blue miracle. For example, about 25 years ago, Alan Sokal made a name for himself because he was able to end up in a humanities journal with a nonsensical article that he rather arbitrarily added postmodern jargon to.